I'm Mirsad. I'm Dean, College of Business Information Technology. On behalf of the President of the University and my colleagues, I welcome you to the second of the Executive Speaker Series. We have a number of friends here and guests, and one individual is Mr. Steve Gregorian. Steve? Mr. Gregorian is president of Detroit Economic Club, and if you have not been a member of Detroit Economic Club, I encourage you to join. Magnificent events happening, and thank you very much. At this time, I'm gonna let Adam to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for being here. I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Michael Arena. He's been the Chief Talent Officer at General Motors since 2012. He's responsible for enterprise talent management, strategic workforce analytics, talent acquisition, executive development, and global learning for 200,000 General Motor employees across the globe. Prior to joining GM, Dr. Arena served as Senior Vice President of Leadership Development for Bank of America's Global Consumer and Small Business Banking Group. He spent 2 years as a visiting scientist within the MIT Technology Media Lab, and he's also currently a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and the D School at Stanford, so a lot of accolades here. He is also the author of a new book released in June of this year called Adaptive Space: How GM and Other Companies Are Disrupting Themselves and Transforming Themselves into Agile Organizations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Arena.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you. Well, good morning on this snowy day, right? So if you're like me, your muscle memory hasn't kicked in, and as soon as you saw snow on your vehicle, you're like, oh, crud, this is coming. So I think we've got a few stragglers coming in a little bit late because of the snow and the weather, but I'm thrilled to be here. And we've been talking about this for a while. Finally, we're able to make it happen. And I want to talk a little bit about networks. The title of the presentation this morning is Transforming Organizations, or Transforming into Agile Organizations. But what I really want to talk about behind that are networks. And I know we've got a bunch of nonprofit folks in the room this morning. I know we've got a handful of students, and you can always tell the students because they sit in the back of the room or they sit at the edge, where they can depart quickly if this starts to become nonsensical. So I just want to let you know, we know you're there and we know where you're sitting. But I want to talk about networks. I want to spend a little bit of time talking really about the power of networks, less so about corporations, although I have to share a little bit about General Motors, and I will, but more so about institutions as a whole, and even you as individuals, and how can you truly leverage the power of your network in order to get stuff done. So with that said, we're going to interact. I promise you're going to interact with me. We're going to engage a bit this morning. We'll get some energy flowing in the room. So let's just start a little bit with General Motors. So we live in the era of disruption. We live in a world where business and/or institutions and much of what we do is being disrupted on a daily basis. Mary Barra, when she stepped into the CEO role at General Motors just about 4 years ago, actually said that we will see more change in the automotive industry in the next 5 years than we have in the last 50. I would argue that about 2 years in, that was already true. I mean, just think about this for a moment. Uber is 7 years old. Now, we use Uber, as a descriptor of how we're going to get around today, and Uber is only 7 years old. It was actually 7 years ago, Uber just started to show up in places like San Francisco. Today, the combination of Uber and Lyft, actually, I think it's 73% of business travel in the US is dominated through Uber and Lyft. Anyone know what happened to taxi cabs in that same time frame? They're virtually unseen, literally virtually unseen, unless you go to some place, like the last stronghold like Manhattan. You can see that just in 5 years, this world of mobility has really, truly transformed. And yet, we need to think about organizations differently, and I can run through this. And the reason we know mobility, the reason we know transportation is being disrupted is because you've got all these new entrants. Google is playing in the automotive space. Apple is hiring more automotive experience engineers. Automotive experience engineer is the exact title of the job that they're hiring right now, and no one really knows why, right? They're up to something. And then, Intel spent $15 billion just about a year ago on a company called Mobileye, which essentially does nothing but provide camera and sensor technologies to the automotive industry. So you can begin to see that the world's about ready to be disrupted here in the automotive industry, and yet you've got traditional players who have pretty much operated the same way they have in the past. So what I want to talk about is this concept of becoming agile, this concept of tapping into the power of your network to become agile, and how we need to disrupt the way we work as a whole. And to do that, I guess I'm going to have to walk over on this side because I'm too far away from the control. There it is. To do that, I need to talk a little bit about some research, and I promise not to, this will be my only research slide. But I need to talk a little bit about some research that we conducted really across the last decade. I was part of a research team. You could tell based on my introduction that I spent time in business, a little bit of time in academia, and we were interested in this question as to why some organizations are adaptive and others aren't. And most notably, we went out and studied a bunch of large companies, and then later we actually did study some nonprofits, and we studied some smaller companies and even startups. And we were interested in why someone like Netflix can continue to reinvent themselves so quickly. If you think about Netflix for a moment, think about Netflix as an institution. Netflix came out as a direct DVD mailing service. They already knew at the moment that they were mailing DVDs and competing against Blockbuster. When's the last time you saw a Blockbuster store, by the way? That's the opposite side of this. But Netflix already knew before they had introduced a physical DVD by mail service that the next wave of technology was going to be live downstreams, live streaming content across the internet. They just knew that whenever they introduced direct mail DVDs, that the technology hadn't quite caught up. So they were already planning for their own demise from the very beginning. Not only that, they quickly knew once they got to streaming that the content was going to become the problem, because the owners of the content, the recording studios that owned the content, were ultimately going to charge more and more of a premium. So they were already beginning to change their whole business model to move into the produced content, self-generated content. And you now know Netflix, their real bread and butter is what they're doing with producing their own content online. But that all started with physical DVDs that they knew wouldn't last for long. In fact, they actually got a lot of kickback from the consumer whenever they tried to migrate away from it too quickly. So when you think about it this way, there are organizations that can be really entrepreneurial, and there are other organizations that cling on, that hold on. Blockbuster is the opposite side of that story, right? Blockbuster had all the physical assets in the world. They had a retail genius running the organization. The problem is they didn't see the wave of activity that you saw on the previous slide sort of jumping into their market, and they didn't respond fast enough. I want to argue, and the reason I want to share this is I want to argue that that's a network problem as much as it is an organizational problem. And the research found that. The research found that fact is it's a social issue as much as anything else. And I'm going to share just a couple little stories before I get into your networks and engage you. And this is one story of the research case. We went out and interviewed 500 people, looked comprehensively at 60 companies. This was one organization. This was an organization that was acquiring another organization. This is a network of individuals. You can see two different organizations here. The pink dots or red dots was a large company that had acquired a smaller company down here in the blue dots. About 6 months in, none of these folks were talking to each other. About 6 folks in fact, the only people that were talking to each other inside this little bubble were required to talk to each other because they were part of the integration team. And reality is, this group was saying, why in the world did we buy this thing? It's not producing anything that we thought it was going to produce, which was, entrepreneur, innovative, sort of new ideas. And then the smaller organization, what do you think they were saying at this point? Anyone? What do you think they were saying about the bigger organization? They're stifling us. They're killing us. They're killing our mojo. And reality is, that is exactly what was happening. Then something amazing happened. And this was learned by mistake by us as we went out and started mapping out these organizations. Something really surprising happened for us. Remember that operational system? This represents that operational system. Remember those entrepreneurial pockets? That's what this is. Every organization we studied had great entrepreneurial pockets or ideas. They just weren't able to actually get those ideas into the formal system. What happened here was literally, there were a handful of really smart people down here. So while this was a failure, this integration seemed to be a failure, what wasn't a failure was they acquired at a very expensive premium, they acquired some very good talent. So they started to move that talent into the business. That network looks like this 9 months later. What do you think started to happen right away? Anyone? I'm not going to be rhetorical in my questions. You got to scream them out. Go ahead. What do you think happened? All of a sudden, the same innovations that they were looking for here that were sort of stifled out or partitioned off from the organization started to pop after they moved a handful of people inside the organization deeper inside. So the reality is, when it comes to how do you adapt like Netflix, how do you continually respond, how as a nonprofit do you think about new funding mechanisms, new campaigns, new programs? As a student, how do you think about keeping yourself creative? The reality is it's a social phenomenon. And that's exactly what we found. We found out that we think of this as being a human capital challenge. We got to hire really, really smart people, and that's only part of the battle. What we also have to do is we have to position those people for tremendous success. So let me say it very simply, and I'm in the human capital space. I run talent for General Motors, so I'm constantly thinking about smart people and developing people, and that matters. I don't want to say that doesn't matter. Your education here matters a lot, but how you're positioned to use that education might matter as much as 40%. And that's what we have found in the new research is as much as 40% of your overall performance is predicated on how well positioned you are to leverage what you know as opposed to just what you know. So just hiring smart people is not enough. If they're partitioned off or marginalized, they can't really use what they know. So, and let me just make this real for a moment. Do you know any really, really smart people that whenever they have to be the smartest person in the room, they step into the room and, they have to have the best idea about everything and anything and all the time. And what do the people around them do? Now, none are in the room right now. I know that, right? So you don't have to point fingers. But what do? They make fun of them. They begin to marginalize them. Your eyes gloss over and you say, this too shall pass. Would this idiot please shut up soon? And all of a sudden you forget the words that are coming out of their mouth. The reality is really smart people marginalized, not positioned to be able to leverage what they know, isn't a successful recipe. And one of the problems we have in institutions is not thinking about social connections as much as we need to. So that's where I want to spend some time. What we found was with the adaptive organizations, is they had a third dimension. Every organization had these. Every organization had formal systems to get stuff done, but only the adaptive ones had something we call adaptive space, which is basically a better understanding of how to leverage their network. So that's the theory. That's the theory I wanted to share with you. Now I want to make it real. And to make it real, I got to make it fun. So let's just start with this. Who's this? What's he known for? Come on, Footloose, right? Wasn't he in Footloose? I said that to my son, and he says, Kevin Bacon wasn't in Footloose. And then I thought, oh my goodness, am I getting old? He actually did a cameo in the second Footloose, just by technicality. But what is Kevin Bacon known for? 6 degrees of separation. So the theory goes like this. Kevin Bacon is no farther removed from any living or deceased actor or actress any more than 6 degrees of separation. Why is that? By the way, that's not even true. 6 degrees is far too big, far too large of a degree of separation number. The actual number is 2.54. There are academics that have studied this, by the way. 2.54. But why is it? And you can prove this. I'm going to actually, you can go out and test this. It's open access data. There's actually something called the Oracle Bacon. If you're on your computer, you can Google it right now. Literally, you can type in any actor or actress, and it will give you a Bacon number. So I did that. I did that just because I wanted to prove. I didn't want to do it live because I didn't know if the internet connection would work. But, if you type in Lori Singer, turns out she had a Bacon number of 1. They were in the same movie together. So I wanted to find someone else. So, okay, what about, George Clooney, a Bacon number of 2. They actually have never been in a movie together, surprisingly enough. But I started typing in all kinds of other numbers like John Wayne and Marilyn Monroe, and I know I'm showing my age now for sure, but they always got a Bacon number of about 2 to 3, back or forth, even if they've been dead for 30 years. So I decided to try to trick the software, and I said, well, what about Mickey Mouse? Turns out the software's smarter than me. It actually substituted Walt Disney for Mickey Mouse, and Walt Disney, who's been dead for years, has a Bacon number of 3. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by that. I had to get a Bacon number of 4, I had to type in Rob Thomas, not the first, not Rob Thomas the second, not even Rob Thomas the third, but Rob Thomas the fourth, some strange micro actor in Australia, in order to get a Bacon number of 4. Is that interesting to you? It's fascinating to me. Why is that? Anyone? Non-rhetorical again. Scream out. Why does Kevin Bacon have such a tight degree of separation number? Anyone? It's not typical. All the movies he's been in? Okay, what else? Scream out some more. His relationships, the size of his network? Okay, what else? Duration? He's been around forever, for goodness sakes, right? So duration has something to do with it. Go ahead. So a lot of really lousy movies. Yeah, we're not even saying Kevin Bacon is a good actor, right? Now, you may argue with that, but all those are partially true but incomplete. Here's the reality of it, and this is why it matters to you. And I'm going to prove why it matters to you with the real character and the real network. So this is hypothetical, but it's approximated. So there's Kevin Bacon in the center. There's another guy over on the right-hand side. Same number of connections. It has very little to do with the size of his overall network, by the way. That's Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey has been stuck in one genre his entire career, right? Kevin Bacon has crossed genres. So here's the real answer to your question. The real answer is, from a network standpoint, Kevin Bacon is a broker. A broker is someone who spans across many diverse populations of people, and that makes him indispensable for a handful of competitive advantages, but it also makes him central to a very broad ecosystem of networks, and that is different genres. He's been in everything from comedies to dramas to horror movies to, he was even the voice in Balto, and again, that's showing some of our ages if we understand who Balto is. But the reality is, Kevin Bacon, is a broker. Why does a broker matter? Why should you be thinking about whether or not you're a broker? Well, here's why. Here's why. Number one, a broker has 3 competitive advantages over the average person in the world. They have early access to new information, they have access to diverse information, and they have control over the dispersion of that information. So, and it turns out they get paid more, they get promoted more frequently, and they get hired more regularly than the average person in the world. Now I'm going to prove this to you. Now I want to make this real. So that's all true, but now I want to make it real inside of a business and/or institution level. Somebody else that we know was a broker. Someone else we know very well who was considered to be one of the most innovative people of our generation was also a broker, and that's Steve Jobs. Here's Steve Jobs' network. Steve Jobs' network actually looks a lot like Kevin Bacon's. This is patent data, real data, patent data inside of Apple, and this is data that basically shows how Steve Jobs was connected at the time, right, 2012, just prior to his death, his premature death, it shows how Steve Jobs was in fact connected as a broker, both inside. This shows inside data, but I've got outside data that also shows the same thing outside as it relates to Steve Jobs. So here's my argument. We think of Steve Jobs as being this brilliant, innovative, strategic, intuitive wizard in many regards. And those things may all be true, may have all been true. I want to argue that it was actually Steve Jobs' network that did much of the work for him. I want to argue that the reason Steve Jobs was all those things is because his network was doing much of that work for him. And that's the question I have for you to make this real is, are you bunkered down, clustered into a Jim Carrey-like network where everybody is connected to everybody else, which means everyone is thinking alike, which means that everyone acts alike, which means there are these social norms, and your ability to learn is diminished significantly? Or are you in a network, are you more of a broker like Steve Jobs? And the answer to that question, by the way, Jim Carrey's network position is very valuable for certain things, but it isn't for innovation. It isn't for gaining new ideas. What he would do very well is execute and deliver and bring things into the world. So that's why this matters to you. What kind of network do you have? Are you a central connector, or are you a Steve Jobs broker in regards to how you operate on a day-to-day basis? And chances are, at any given point in time, you're one or the other. And that's what I want to spend some time with. To do that, I want to talk about a handful of network principles. So now this is true outside of any corporation, and quite simply, there are things you can do to actually activate this. And some core social capital principles are quite simple. If you want to learn, go to the edge. If you want to learn like Steve Jobs, get outside of your bubble, get outside of your day-to-day interactions of people that you see who have a lot of what we call redundant ties, and go to the edge. And we'll talk more about that. If you want to bring something in the world, ideas are cheap. Learning new ideas is not enough. If you want to bring something into the world, go find a friend. I'll talk more about that. If you want to get that thing diffused into the world, follow the energy. Actually, conflict matters in a positive way at some stage in the process. And then if you're trying to get things formalized, and this can happen in any ecosystem or any outside network as well as inside, try to close your network in on a person. And that's where I want to spend the rest of my time talking to you about, or talking with you. And I want to start by talking about engaging the edges. So if you want to learn, nothing amazing has ever happened without the courage to go to the edge. So think about that for a moment. I would challenge you to think about anything breakthrough in the world that didn't require somebody to go out on the edge and discover something new, right? We think of that as, we call them explorers for a reason. They're going out on the edge. They're going to uncharted territory. They're going to discover something new. And the same thing is true for us. In network theory, we say it's at the intersection of the networks where new things are discovered. It's at these intersections where one group comes together with another group, and at that intersection where the brokers reside, new things are discovered. In sort of the biological world, we call them the tidal pools, right? Think about a tidal pool for a moment. There are more discoveries and more mutations and more emergent life species in the tidal pools than any place else on land, on Earth, if you will. And that happens because of this collision of all these different things and dynamics. And it's fragile, by the way. It's not always a great place to reside, but that's where many things originate. Many things originate on the edges. And that's what I want to spend a little time talking to you about. If you're trying to create breakthrough, you better get outside of your day-to-day. And this is my favorite network diagram. Of all the network diagrams that I've ever created, this is my favorite. This is the savannah, and this is where things can be discovered, right? So you've got the speed of a gazelle, you've got the power of a water buffalo, or the endurance of a zebra, and then you got this guy right here. I think it's a guy. I don't know for sure, but you've got this little sort of explorer, right? You're sort of hanging out in the center, right? That's the Steve Jobs of the world. That is the Steve Jobs network. So the question is, are you going to places to learn new things? Are you staying inside of your own practice? Are you staying inside of your own institution? Because you need to get outside in order to discover. So I promised I was going to engage you. So I want to engage you now. So I want you to, everyone stand up and find 2 other people, and only pick one person who's a facilitator, but get in a triad and pick one person who's a facilitator. Okay, here's what I want you to do. So I want you each to just take 10 seconds and share something interesting, something that you're currently working on. Just take 10 seconds. You're a fast group. 10 seconds and do that real quickly, all 3 of you. Okay, so let's stop there. So facilitators. So if you're a facilitator, listen to me. If you're a facilitator, I want you to stand up if you're sitting, and I want you to migrate to a different group. So I want you to go find someone else. The pair stays there. Facilitator migrates to a different group. Go ahead and do that. And then repeat the same thing. So rotate to a different group. Repeat the same thing. So facilitators should be moving around the room if you haven't already. So you should have rotated if you haven't. Okay, so I'm going to stop you there. So facilitators, I want you to remain where you are, standing. So listen up, everyone. So listen up. This won't work if we're not all. So I want facilitators, I want you to remain standing where you are. Everybody else go find a seat. So just facilitators, stay standing where you are. If you're sitting, stand up, facilitator. So stay where you are. Everyone else go sit down. So look around the room. So for those of you sitting, look around the room. So here's what I want to tell you about the people who are standing. They're worth twice as much as you all are. Go ahead and sit down. So the reality is, and again, it's just a fun little activity, but the reality is the people that remain standing, the science says they're actually worth 3 times as much. And that's a rigorous study done by Ron Burt at the University of Chicago. Brokers are worth 3 times as much. The reason is because they have access to more information and control over the diffusion through their relationship network beyond the people who stayed inside their dyad, if they will. The other folks have deep trust, but that's not enough to explore and discover. So if you want to learn, if you want to discover, if you want to innovate, if you want to create, get outside of your comfort zone and go learn, go engage with new people, and that's the way it happens. And if I would have kept doing this, you would have had access to much more information. And it turns out that if you stay inside of your day-to-day operations, that you're hardly likely to discover anything new. So let me put that in real business context. So here's what we know about the world. What we know about the world is that virtually all of the world's growth is happening inside of urban environments. On an annual basis, the world's population has grown at 1.84%. 1.84%, and all of that is happening inside of urban environments. Fact is, inside of developed countries, about 70% of the current population already lives inside of cities. And I don't know if you've ever driven around inside of a city lately, but it's not necessarily a fun activity, is it? Driving from one place to the other in Manhattan might actually be as much of a burden as a benefit. So that might be a problem if you sell a lot of trucks in the center of the country, right? So we know how to sell trucks. We know how to make trucks. The world's population is migrating to cities. If we continue to focus on selling trucks in rural areas, that might be a problem for us. So what we did was we sent out a group of people using design thinking methodologies. We sent out a group of people to act as brokers to engage the edges and go discover what they could find inside of these urban environments. And what that led to is a new product for General Motors that you probably have heard about. If you haven't, you will, called Maven. And Maven was discovered by going to the edge and engaging in these city environments and better understanding what people needed from a mobility standpoint. And what we found out was that people wanted access over ownership. People actually wanted access to a vehicle, and Lyft and Uber provided some support for that because it could actually get them from point A to point B, but they still wanted to have access and drive their own vehicle. And at times they needed to get outside of the city, and at times they needed to go to Whole Foods and do a grocery run, and Lyft and Uber weren't convenient for that. So we actually created something that we call Maven. Maven is not a ride-sharing platform, it is a car-sharing platform. So reality is, your car right now, you're not using it, correct? I don't think so. I don't know how you would be. Maybe somebody else is, and then it means that it's a more fully deployed asset, but mostly, I bet, that your vehicle is sitting in the parking lot right now. That is an undeployed asset that can be fully deployed, just like Airbnb, if you have the right platform. That is where Maven comes in. Within the first year, we scaled Maven across 17 cities because it was resonating with people. And today, you can actually, through Maven Car Share, you can actually put your vehicle into the platform, and your vehicle could be borrowed by other people in this moment that you're not using it, and be a more fully deployed asset. And the reality is that helps to do a lot of different things for the world, but we would have never discovered that if we stayed inside of our little dyad and always thought about things the way we did without first going out to the edge. So does that make sense? So but that's not enough. Please, yes.
This is not appropriate, but how do you hire brokers? What are you looking for in brokers?
Interesting question. So one thing I would say is that you are not fixated to become a broker. So brokerage is not about a third of your potential to become a broker is driven based on your personality, about a third. The other 2/3 is based on role and or how your network is configured. So the 5 people that went out and discovered this new solution were not brokers, but we nudged them and we pushed them out so you can actually create the circumstances to generate brokerage. And what I would say is more often than not, that's what you want to be doing. So hiring brokers, you can certainly do that. And the answer to the question is I look for things like curiosity. I look for things like people that get bored really quickly when they get focused on one thing. So there are personality traits that you can look for, But about 2/3 of your ability to become a broker is predicated on how you're enabled by the organization and or institution. And if you're actually rewarded for execution, the chances of you being a broker, even if you've got personality traits to be a broker, are diminished. So the point I'm really trying to make is, as an organization, we need to value brokerage more than what we have because it pays. And it pays more in the world of disruption than it used to. So thank you. Great question. Great question. But that's not enough, remember? Ideas are cheap. I said that before. Ideas are cheap. You've got to bring those ideas into the world. I am a broker, and I have 10 new ideas. I have some friends sitting in the back row that will tell you I have at least 10 ideas every single day. But the reality is, most of those ideas are pretty bad. The reality is, I will do little with most of those ideas. So to bring those ideas into the world, I need to go find a friend. I need to find somebody who I can partner up with who can, first of all, provide some face merit or face validity that this idea isn't crazy and I haven't gone too far out on the edge. You know, the edge is a fine line, right? I mean, you could get too far out there, and that's where finding a friend to bring it back in and ground it in, you know, sort of the business and or the institution's purpose matters a lot. The second thing is when I have an idea, my first inclination is to go find a leader. My first inclination is to get my idea formally adopted. You know, maybe I'll share it with the professor. Maybe I'll share it with the managing director. That's my first inclination. The reality is that's the dumbest thing in the world to do. I mean, I'm laying it out there. Like, leaders say no a lot. Leaders are predisposed to saying no a lot. The reason is because they've got a lot of priorities and they get lots of ideas. So a far better strategy is to go find a friend and to play with that idea, to build that idea up. And what we know is that friends help make our ideas contagious. Friends help make our ideas contagious. Friends are how we get ideas adopted, and that's where you need to find somebody to be able to help develop that idea. So all great development happens locally. You know, so ideas out in the open space aren't enough. You've got to bring them into the world. You've got to bring them into the physical reality of manifestation of a product or service or solution, and that happens locally. That happens in small groups. And let me just ask the question, do you know this person? What did he do? What did he invent? I don't have his network, by the way. I wish I did. I wish I had his network. I'm going to make an assertion about his network. But what did he invent? I gave you the answer. It's morning still. The light bulb, right? You know, Thomas Edison, and he invented the light bulb, amongst many other things. Reality is, in about an 8-year time frame, there were 400 patents filed at Menlo Park Laboratories. It was actually called the Invention Factory, and he was called the Wizard of Menlo. And in fact, all of his name was on all 400 patents, but I bet you haven't heard of these guys, and they were all guys. Have you heard of them, the Muckers? The Muckers was a small band of friends, you know, that worked inside of Menlo Laboratories across that 8-year duration, a very small group of people that actually took ideas, many of them coming from Edison, because Edison actually played a broker at many points in time in his life, and brought those ideas into a lab where they could tinker, experiment, explore, iterate, and build and reconfigure. And we all know 10,000 filaments for the light bulb. It was actually 3,000, and it was actually Charles Batch that tested those 3,000. It wasn't Edison himself, and Charlie Batch actually tested those and came up with the right filament that would work and stand up as a commercial success for 1,200 hours at a given point in time. That happens through rapid iteration. That happens through friends working with other friends, bringing ideas into the world. Amazon calls those 2 pizza teams. Small 2 pizza teams, small groups of people, 4 to 6 people that are actually bringing ideas into the world, iterating on them. This is the magic of Amazon, by the way. They don't talk about this a whole lot, but this is the magic of Amazon. Amazon knows that if you want to invent stuff, you do it in small groups. If you want to create something new, you don't do that at large scale across the broad organization. You do it in a bunch of small 2 pizza teams, and they do it with one purpose in mind. And then as soon as they accomplish that purpose, just like Thomas Edison's Muckers did, they disband that group and that group goes and works on the next big thing, the next idea. This is how we're creating self-driving technology inside General Motors. Yes, please.
If I was one of those muckers,
Yes.
if I didn't see and learn from the whole thing, this particular thing helped Edison very much, but nobody knows my name.
Yeah.
And once you see that I'm not going to be part of another mucker or another,
So this is the core dilemma of getting bold new ideas invented out in the world in the context of this is social and not human capital driven. Now, it is very true. Your point is absolutely spot on. Thomas Edison took all the credit for all that work. Now, some of those muckers had their names on some of the patents, but Thomas Edison truly did take all the credit. In today's world, what we're seeing more and more of is, who's taking the credit in Amazon? It's not necessarily Bezos. It's basically Amazon as an organization. And what we found in our research, and I hate to say this out loud because I know it will make some of you angry, is that innovation is a humbling sport. Innovation is a humbling sport. If you will, what we found was this. In the cases where organizations were adaptive, we would go talk to someone, and they would tell us to go talk to someone else, and they would tell us then to go talk to someone else. And what we realized was that idea had proliferated the whole way on across an organization. In the cases where there was a great idea that never saw the light of day, we would actually go talk to the very first person. We go talk to Jim, and Jim would say, you need to go talk to Frank. And we go talk to Frank, and Frank would go ballistic. Frank would start raging about all the idiots that he works with, how all these people won't listen to him. And it turns out that Frank had a really good idea, but Frank needed to keep the idea for himself, and he did. And the world never saw it. So what I'm saying to you, and again, like this or not, the brutal reality of the world we live in is innovation and creativity and coming up with new campaigns is as much of a social thing as it is an individual. The lone inventor is a myth, and there's lots of research done that shows that the lone inventor is a myth, and it's even a myth back to Thomas Edison's days. So that's the point that I would like to sort of leave you on. Like it or not, it's a reality. And you can cling on to your idea if you're Frank, and there is a very rare scenario where Frank may actually get his idea noted, but almost in the academic world, almost all the home run papers are written in collaboration today. A home run paper is a paper that has 100 or more citations in the lit stream. That is almost all of them are happening with 2 or 3 collaborators. Almost none of them happen through a sole researcher doing a radical breakthrough any longer. It's just not the way the world works, sadly. Or maybe not sadly, I don't know. But you can actually, if you know this, you can actually leverage it to your benefit. So this is the cruise automation. Cruise automation, if you don't know cruise automation is our self-driving technology bet. We will have a commercialized self-driving vehicle on the road next year. You'll see that in 2019. That will be a vehicle without a driver behind the driver's seat. And that happened in about an 18-month time frame. The development of that process, that technology, happened in about 18 months. Turns out that 4 generations of self-driving technology have been created by Cruise Automation out in San Francisco, which we own. And 18 months, 4 generations of self-driving technology. It takes us 4 years to design a vehicle. The reason that it worked here so much more quickly is because of these small 2-pizza teams that you see on the right-hand side. Many, many small teams are working on many different parts of an algorithm, and some of them may be working on the maps, some of them may be working on the geosensing technologies, some of them may be working on sensor technologies and cameras or LiDAR systems, and each of those small pockets, that at that point in time was 150 people, were all working on small parts of the algorithm. As that, 1.5 terabytes of data comes in every single day from a vehicle, it's plugged into the bat, these folks go to work, like 2 pizza teams in Amazon, on their small piece, and then it's synchronized at the end so that the pieces work well together through the syncing mechanism in the center. This is how innovation happens today. Speed matters a lot, and that happens through small groups of friends working on a core part of an overall solution, if you will. And it can happen, if you think about this in a nonprofit, a couple people working on a campaign, and a couple other people going out and doing the development part of that campaign, and a couple other people doing the solution side of that will happen much more rapidly than if you actually have everybody working on everything. Why? Because there's no shifting cost. And why? Because 2 or 3 people working together knows really intimately how they complement one another, just like the muckers did. That's how innovation is happening. If you want to do it fast, this configuration works 10 times faster than the more traditional development model. So find a friend is the short answer. If you want to bring something into the world and you want to do it quickly, go find a friend, and then go find another friend to be able to help you bring that into the world and build a prototype, build the solution, and then ultimately go test it. And to do that, you need to use the third principle that I want to talk about, which is follow the energy. And follow the energy is basically now 2 or 3 of us have an idea, now maybe even 4 of us have an idea, but does the rest of the world view that idea as valuable? And you can tell a lot by watching people, right? When you share something, you can tell a lot by watching people. And what you really want to do is you want to start shopping that idea around. Shopping it around your ecosystem, your network, your funding network, if you will. If you're a student, other students, and start shopping it around and seeing how they respond to it. Because sometimes ideas are bad, and sometimes they're not. And what you're trying to do is build social proof for that idea. So let me skip forward a couple. What's this? Anyone know? What is this? Where did I pull this from? An Apple campaign. What is Apple doing here? So they're showing something that it's cool, right? So it's cool. This is actually an iPod. Before we had iPhones, for some of you who are a little younger, we used to actually have these devices that would only have music on them. That was it. And they had these clunky sort of navigation systems on it. But whenever this first came out in 2001, this was a campaign ad from Apple. What is Apple trying to do here? I'm trying to get to a very specific point. All your friends are doing it. They're trying to make it cool. They're trying to make it cool. So they're creating these cool little commercials. Here's the most important part that I want to highlight to you. Here's one of the things, those clever people at Apple, I almost cursed. I never curse. They knew that this device was going to be inside your pocket, right? They also knew that black headphones were all over the world. So what did they do? They made them white. Why did they make them white? Because that was the only part that you could actually see, and that was the part that made you cool. What they were doing was creating social proof that having an iPod in your pocket made you really, really cool. And the way you knew you had one of those is because those were white. Now, does that stink? It actually makes me mad when I think about it today. But the reality is they were following the energy. They were creating small bursts of, sort of coolness, if you will, and other people were seeing these things, and they were recognizing that this was cool, and they used that to actually amp up their overall product. And they've been doing that over and over again in the way that they think about marketing. The same thing is true if you're thinking about a campaign in a nonprofit. How do you make it cool? How do you have other people, friends, buy in, and how do you follow the energy? How do you create social proof? How do you make it cool to be at this fundraiser because someone else really, really cool is going to be there? That's the same phenomenon that I'm talking about. Build energy, follow energy. It could equally go the other way, by the way. This is a story that many of us don't know, and what we don't know is that the lack of energy could also tell you a whole lot. So this was Biz Stone, who was one of the core founders of Twitter, and at that point in time, Evan Williams was running a company called Odeo. Anyone ever hear of Odeo? Anyone? Of course not, because they never did anything. But they were a small company that Evan Williams was running at that point in time. They were actually an iPod company, and they basically would curate iPods, or podcasts is what I'm trying to say. They would actually curate podcasts to be pushed out onto your iPod. And Evan Williams noticed something one day. His own employees weren't even using their tools. He noticed that the very own employees actually thought that their product sucked. And he basically literally called a recess one day. Literally realized that they're bleeding funding. They can't keep this thing moving. they're not getting any buzz in the marketplace. So they literally called a recess, and he says, I want you in small teams of 2 or 3 to go out I want you to go hack away our product. I want you to hack it, I want you to break it, and I want you to reinvent what we should do. Sitting on a sliding board, no kidding, sitting on a sliding board was Biz Stone, and he actually came up with the working case for Twitter. As a result of, we have a product that no one likes, so let's go and reinvent it so that you could also follow the lack of energy, or notice the lack of energy and go create energy, and it matters a lot because energy flows across an organization. So let me do one other little activity with you. So I'm going to have you stand up again. This time just pair up. This time just pair up and pick an A and a B person. Pick an A person and a B person. That's it. Okay, A's. A's. Here's what I want you to do. A's, I want you to think of an idea that you have. I want you to think about this brilliant idea that you have that you want to convince B is the right thing to do. So spend a little bit of time thinking about your elevator pitch, what's your argument, what's your business, whatever you want to think about, think about that idea. B's, here's what I want you to do. Everything imaginably possible to ignore A. Ready, set, go. Okay, stop. So let's stop there. So who influenced whom? A's or B's? Who influenced whom the most? A's or B's? Who influenced whom? B's. B's didn't do anything. How could the B's influence? What? They made A's adapt? Oh, okay. How did the B's influence? We agree, right? B's influenced? Why? By ignoring, by making them feel bad, by knocking them off course. The reality is, and by the way, some of you are really good at this. I know who has practice based on this exercise. This is what we use as a selection mechanism inside of corporations these days. What's the point I'm trying to make? What's the point I'm trying to make? Anyone? Scream it out. Yeah. So energy matters. Energy matters. Reality is, your energy actually elevates or dampens someone else's idea. Whether you know it or not, whether you're engaged or not, whether you care or not, the way you show up matters immensely. You can tell a whole lot about looking at people, right? You can tell a whole lot. You can tell whether or not someone's interested or not right away, right? You know whether or not, in this middle picture at the bottom, whether or not you're hitting a chord or something's about ready to go awry here, right? So the point, go ahead and take your seats. The point is, the way we show up in our network, the energy that we show up with matters immensely. And what you didn't know is that while you were doing this, I was snapping some pictures of you. I was doing some ethnography work in the field. And by the way, this is what some of the killer bees looked like the first time. This is, the bees, this is what you looked like. This is what you looked like. And, if we would have done this another round, if we had more time, I would have forced the A's to be engaged, and they would have looked a little bit more like this. So I wasn't able to do that one, but what's the point? Which of those two groups, which of those two would you rather interact with? The latter, right? The latter. And it turns out that a good idea is only part of it. Finding an idea, building that idea, and then presenting that idea and or concept is only part of it. You've got to engage the other person. You've got to make sure that they're interested in it in such a way that they get buzzed up. And what we know is that passion spreads informally. Regardless of what change efforts, regardless of what formal campaigns you put in place, the way energy spreads, the way passion spreads is informal, person to person. It happens person to person. And if you know that, right away, you know a few things about how to make change happen, how to make agility happen inside of an organization. This is a real network of how energy clusters on the network. The blue dots are energized cells. The red dots are de-energized cells. And what you notice right away is that pockets of light cluster with each other. And the simple advice that I'll provide to you, more than anything else I'll say today, is avoid the energy vampires, those red pockets, because they will suck the life out of you, even if you don't know it, even if you don't realize it. They will suck the life out of you, and find the positive pockets. If you want to get your idea adopted, the worst thing to do early on, now conflict matters later, and I'm going to be a hypocrite in just a second about this, but I'll tell you why. Conflict matters later, but early on, before that idea has taken off and has gotten energized across the system, the worst thing to do is to take it to the naysayers, because they will kill it and it will suffer a premature death. One of the reasons I tell you to avoid leaders is because leaders are more predisposed to being de-energizers than energizers. Now, that may not be true in every organization, but across organizations, that is generally true. So find the positive pockets. Here's the brutal truth. If somebody who you interact with is criticizing somebody who's not with you in your little pocket at that point in time, like they're bad-mouthing them, they're criticizing them, what do you think they're doing when you're not around? About you? Likewise, if someone is buzzing someone else up, if someone is, bragging on someone is amping them up, what do you think they're doing when you're not there? Now, I know that this isn't a one-for-one, but the reality is, negativity kills. Negativity drags everybody down, and it has a dampening effect. Fourfold is the actual answer, fourfold. It will pull you down fourfold if you hang in a de-energized crowd. So go find the energizers, find those positive pockets, and leverage them. So this is, some General Motors data. We actually mapped out energy inside of a network. 750 people. You can't see all these dots, but there were 750 people. And just by using some of the simple math algorithms, I took 2 people. That was it, just 2. And these 2 people were informal leaders. They weren't even formal leaders. They're in the center of the network. And I used this algorithm to light up their energy effect inside the network. Turns out that 2 people light up 23% of a 750-person network. That's just 2 people who aren't even formal leaders. If you can find your energizers, if you can find those positive pockets, you can get your ideas ignited in a whole different way. And that includes outside of organizations. If you can find your high energy development pockets, you can get funding and you can get it amplified, and the network starts to do the work for you, is the point. Same thing true for if you're looking for a job. If you can get people buzzed up and you're hanging out with people that are in a positive network, the chances of them buzzing you up and advocating for you when you're not around, they close your network for you, will get you noticed. Your network talks about you, by the way. It's just, the question is just, what are they saying? And based on who they are, you've got a pretty good understanding of what they're saying when you're not there. So this is serious business, and it will make you successful or not, depending on the way you're thinking about your network. Cool? By the way, if you want to make that happen inside of an organization, if you invite only energizers into a room like this, if you actually know who those energizers are and you invite them in, we do this through something we call tipping forward. You invite only the believers, the people that are actually the positive people, into a room like this. They will amp up your ideas and pick them up, and what they become are carriers of ideas across an organization. And if you can seed your network with energizers, somebody can get up on stage like this and present an idea, and the chances of somebody in the network or auditorium grabbing it and sharing it externally, outwardly, is much, much greater. 3x is the number. So vampires suck the life out of you at a 4x level. Energizers lift up other people's ideas at a 3x level. And this stuff matters tremendously. This is why I believe we will be talking about energy versus engagement inside of corporations at a very near period in time. Yes? So in this case, we actually, we know we've got an assessment. So we run this simple little assessment, and we know who's predisposed to being an energizer. Okay? And by the way, if you want to understand a corporation that did that brilliantly, just look at DaVita. DaVita is, for those of you that don't know DaVita as an organization, it's a dialysis company. There perhaps could be nothing more grim in reality to be in this business. This business sucks, literally. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I think the number is 1 out of 4 dialysis patients, live about a year. That's it. And that's what they're running. But this is their annual meeting. It doesn't look like a healthcare dialysis facility. This company went on the verge of being bankrupt to being one of the world's most admired brands perpetually, based on just amping up the energy inside the organization and finding energizers and hiring energizers in such a way that people believe passionately with great conviction about what they do. That's why this stuff matters. That's why it's so critical. Now, I did say I would be a hypocrite, right? I did say that at some point conflict matters. And here's when conflict matters. Conflict matters after that idea has been buzzed up and amped down across the organization. Conflict helps to pressure test an idea. Late stage, conflict actually helps to take that idea and disrupt the status quo to get a new idea ushered in. Conflict actually helps to say, why are we in the physical DVD business when in fact we should be streaming content live? It's conflict. That takes conflict. If you have an absence of conflict, you will never disrupt yourself. You will never break down the status quo. And what we know is conflict helps to usher in new solutions at a broad level. And there is lots of research out there on this, but I'll tell a story. I'll tell one of my favorite stories. I retrospectively went back and studied Walt Disney. And Walt Disney had a vision, and this was after he was successful with Mickey Mouse and animation characters, but he had a different vision. His vision was he wanted to create a full-length animation movie. We now know that it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Anyone know what the response was when Disney had this vision in 1934? Anyone know what the response was? Even his own wife was against him. Even his wife, Lily, said, Walt, I think you maybe should reconsider this. His brother, who managed the finances, was outraged by the whole thing. His brother was just screaming and raging against him. In 2000, so I'll fast forward and then go backwards. In 1937, after 3 or 4 years of production, 1937, Radio Music Hall in Los Angeles, California, a premiere event like this, was the first full-length, reveal of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. At the end of it, Disney had invested his entire life in this, of the last 3 years, and his life's funding, and then some, went into debt. At the end of it, at the end of this movie, Disney's sitting in the front center row, and the theater is dead silent. I'm sure, and he described this later in his memoirs, that it felt like an eternity as the room was completely silent, and he had these thoughts: this is my doom. This was my doom. And then in just about a moment later, everyone jumped up on their feet and started standing and screaming, in hysteria about the sheer brilliance that they just saw on stage. And the headlines rode next day, Walt Disney creates sheer brilliance. Just 2 days before that, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was called Disney's Folly. In a different ad, Disney's Folly. So how did Walt Disney overcome that conflict? How did he overcome that conflict? This story synthesizes everything that I've said so far. How did he do it? First of all, he went to the edge and he had a vision. He had a vision that, in fact, animation wasn't only for 10-minute cartoons. Animation could be emotional. Animation could be dramatic. Animation could draw you in. Animation could be something that would be incredibly compelling, and even an adult would enjoy animation. That's the first thing. That's an edge. Then he, on a stage, much like this one, on a dark stage, in 3 years prior to the release of the film, in 1934, Disney brought in his core team of folks. So it wasn't a whole auditorium, but his core team of animators. He came up on stage and he physically worked out, acting out every single character in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Physically on stage himself, 2 hours, dark, silent, while people were listening. What was he trying to do? He was getting his friends to buy into his vision. He was getting his handful of friends who he trusted to actually become compelled. He was trying to build energy inside the system. The rest of the next 3 years was a journey of really Walt Disney using his network to catapult this movie, to the level, to the success that it actually, reached. And he did lots of little tricks. One of the things he did was the characters were jerky. The characters were animation characters, and his animators didn't know how to draw real-life figures, so he brought in ballerinas and literally had ballerinas dancing across the stage and had his animators drawing what those dance movements looked like so he could make the characters more real. He actually created gags. He created challenges. He tried to do some conflict, some competitions with each other, and one of the gags was if you could actually surprise one of the other animators with a personality trait or characteristic of one of the dwarfs so that they were all 7 very, very unique personalities, he would pay you $5. He would give you a bonus of $5. So all these little things in priming his network ultimately ramped up to become the success of Snow White. And that's where conflict matters. Conflict matters at the end because you need to make sure that you're actually listening to what people are saying so that you can respond to it. Perhaps the most brilliant person today at being able to do this is Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos says, you can't have breakthrough without something to break through. So if there's no conflict, we know that we're not going to do anything provocative. The way I like to think about it is conflict is a compliment. If you're trying to be disruptive, conflict is a compliment. If no one resists my idea, then it must not be very bold. And that's why conflict matters, and that's how you engage in conflict in the end. And I'll share this one last story before I share the last principle and finish up here. I like to use this analogy. Does anyone know what kind of airspeed or land speed a Boeing 747 needs for liftoff? Anyone know? Any aeronautical engineer? I always have to ask this question because I'm always afraid that somebody's going to actually shred apart my theory. But go ahead. 300 miles per hour. The answer is they need 180 miles per hour land speed to get liftoff for a Boeing 747. So conventional wisdom would say this: if the wind is blowing, I want the tailwind to lift me off sooner, right? No. Turns out that if the tailwind doesn't help at all, if I fly into a headwind of 30 miles per hour, I get airspeed liftoff of 150 miles per hour. That's what conflict does. If you want liftoff sooner, later in the stage, now you have to have a Boeing 747 that's functionally sound enough to actually stand up against the resistance. But if you want liftoff sooner, charge into the conflict, listen to the people around you, pivot, respond to it, and then you get liftoff sooner, just like Disney did. Disney didn't ignore it. Disney soaked it all in. And Walt Disney actually then absorbed it and used it to his benefit to create energy with his animators. And so, in short, if you want to actually make change happen, let me talk about the last principle and then I'll finish up. In short, the final thing you want to do is you want to close the network in on formal leaders. The final thing you want to do is you want to create network closure on the decision makers. So this is where leadership matters immensely. This is where sponsors and funders and professors for students matter a lot, right? Up until now, you're bringing a new idea into the world. You're playing with friends to get it energized. You're dealing with some of the conflict that you get from feedback, like Twitter did, and then ultimately, you're closing your network in on your leader. So if you actually want your leader to buy into something, get your network talking about that something before you ever go talk to them. So if you want to get an idea developed, get your network energized about it, and chances are they're already talking about it before you go make the pitch. Guess what? Half the battle's already won. Your reputation already exists because somebody knows you for that idea, and your network's already talking about it. So what we know about most business decisions are they're about 80% emotional. So the studies say that 80% of business decisions are emotional. We make those decisions in the first 30 seconds, and then we look for substantiating objective facts to validate the decision that we emotionally want to make. And only if those facts are lousy might we reverse our emotional decision. Behavioral economists have shown, and some of you in the room probably know this better than I do, that about 80% of our decisions are irrational and emotional. And we then use objective facts and maybe even distortion to support our case. And if you can actually leverage that to your benefit, you can get people to buy into your ideas sooner. So at the end of the day, if you want to make a difference inside of a large company, if you want to make a difference inside of your ecosystem, if you want to make a difference inside of your small little community, what you've got to do is you first, just to do something different and think differently, you've got to go to the edge. You then have to go find a few friends to work with that idea to bring it into the world so it's a physical manifestation of something, service or solution. You then have to leverage energy inside your network to get it amped up. Deal with the conflict then and only then, and then ultimately what happens is you close your network in on core decision makers to disrupt the status quo. That's what adaptive space is. And if you think about change this way, and you think about agility this way, what ends up happening is you can disrupt yourself before being disrupted. So that was what I wanted to share with you. So thank you for that, and I'll ask what questions you might have. So we have just a few moments for questions. So any questions, I'll repeat them. So please.
Okay, my question is about leaders.
Yes.
Because throughout your talk, you talk about leaders being naysayers and leading the teams. Just say no, you cannot go to the leader. On the other hand, leaders are the ones that will allow or not to.
So I completely. Thank you for asking that question. I believe leadership is more important than ever after coming through this research program, by the way. So even though I say things about leaders, I think we overamp leaders in certain areas of this development process, and we underappreciate them in others. So there are two really critical roles in leadership, and we've written about this in the literature. I won't bore everybody, but the first one is you've got to have some degree of freedom to do any of this. So if a leader isn't providing some degree of freedom for people to experiment and go to the edges, if a leader is forcing you to be locked down in your day-to-day things and execute, you can't have this, by the way. And leaders enable that. Leaders enable that, but that's a different type of leadership than what we think about with strategic leadership. If you create the environment for this to emerge, that's a critical characteristic for leaders. The second one is late stage. Sponsoring leadership late stage, once there's a real thing to sponsor, actually makes a lot more sense because rather than sponsoring hundreds of things, you can sponsor 10 things and hedge your bets and resource them appropriately. So it's just the nuance of leadership shifts. Enabling leadership, which is what we describe this as, I won't bore you, but complexity leadership. Complexity leadership says there are two core dimensions of leadership. One is enabling, which is the front part that I described, and then the second one is sponsoring. That comes late. So I oftentimes say leadership late is great. Leadership early could be detrimental outside of creating the conditions for this to be able to happen. So thank you. And I would have been remiss if I didn't at least talk about that. Yes, please.
How would you define change in one word?
Say it again.
How would you define change in one word?
In one word. Oh, wow. Wow. I don't know that I can define change. I'll call it agility. If I had to have one word and you really, sort of pushed me, I would say agility. The way we think about change is wrong in my estimation today. We think about change as these slow, periodic shifts across time. We think about it as something that we can manage, something that we can prepare for, and I think those are true. But the reality is change is much more sudden. It's burst today. The reality of the world we live in today is moving faster than most of our institutions. Somebody once said that irrelevance happens when the external world is moving at a faster pace than the internal world. You're at risk of becoming irrelevant, I think is the direct quote, when the outside world is moving as fast as the inside world. Most of our ways of thinking about traditional change, are predicated on slow, methodical, belief systems. And the reality is it's happening in sudden bursts, punctuated equilibrium. A new entrant comes on. No one could have predicted Uber, 7 years ago. No one. And if you were trying to predict Uber, you would have missed it. And who knows what the next Uber is going to be in my industry? Who knows what the next Netflix or Napster or someone else is going to be in yours? The reality is, as Thomas Feldman says, the world has become flat, and lots of people have access to all kinds of brilliant things. That creates sudden bursts of change. And I'm not even talking about policy changes and all the other sort of bizarreness that exists in the world today. So agility. If you can be agile, you can change. Please, yes? Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. Yeah. I think that one of the things, so agility has gotten a little bit out of hand in my estimation, to your point exactly. So the comment was that agility works at the small level, but what about a large organization of, I don't know, 300,000 plus people? The answer is, on that very first diagram I showed you entrepreneurial pockets, and then I showed you an operational system. McKinsey did this really phenomenal study. McKinsey studied organizations that they thought were agile, and their description of agile is a little bit different than what I've heard in the software development world, which is organizations that can respond quickly to the outside world, but stabilize just as quickly in order to generate results. And what they found was, so that gets to your point, that you're agile places, but you're stable in other places. Both are necessary. That's why operational systems still don't go away. And what McKinsey found is that, and this is only in the corporate world, this particular study, is that only 12% of companies are able to do both of those things. So what I say, so my direct response to your comment is that I want to be agile on the edges. I don't want to be agile in the core. In the core, I want to be precise, durable. I want to be able to deliver with precision and efficiency, and that still matters. But I want to be agile enough on the edges that I can disrupt the core whenever there's a better way to do it. And I think Netflix is again, I keep using Netflix. Amazon does this brilliantly. They innovate on the edges, they pull it into the core, and then they become an operational engine. I mean, just think of their fulfillment centers. I mean, they're as operational as you can get, and I'm holding them up as the benchmark here. The reason is because they can move fast to the next thing, then they can stabilize around the next thing and generate profit, benefit, and income from that. So great point, thank you. Yes, would you follow up? A couple others, so okay, so let's grab a couple others. Yes, please.
Let me get you on the microphone real quick.
That's a little scary. Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Terry Barclay. I'm the CEO of Inform, and we do a lot of work with GM. One of the things that fascinates me about this network research is the issue of inclusion and diversity as it relates to networks. And could you comment a little bit on that and how you see that impacting?
First of all, I think this is a topic that we could spend the rest of the afternoon on. I think we will very quickly, so I'm thrilled with the diversity and inclusion movement that we're talking more and more about inclusion. I mean, still diversity matters, right? But more and more about inclusion. On the network, I can see inclusion. So the thing about a network is those two people that were in the center of that network, they're fully included because they're in the center of the network. If you're just looking at diversity numbers inside of an organization, and let's just say you're happy that you're 50-50 and pick whatever demographic you want. Let's just say that you're content that you're 50-50. Well, if all of the diversity is on the edges, this is a little bit different than the last response. If all that diversity is on the edges, you don't have an inclusive culture. What you want to think about is diversity in the core. So I think what's happening, and what we see on networks, by the way, gender stratifies more strongly than any other variable on a network. So what I know right away, like if we were to break right now and we were to go out and do a social in the hallway, I would almost virtually guarantee you that men would gather with men and women would gather with women. It happens. We don't even know it's happening, but it's happening, and all the researchers have studied this. So what you want to do is you want to mix that up, and you want to bring diversity into the core, and if you can do that, you get the real benefits of diversity inside of an organization on all kinds of different levels, and we've been starting to map that on a little bit more. So great question, thank you. And there are a lot of people doing some really cool research on this. Yes, please, in the back corner.
Let me get you the microphone real quick.
Yes.
Could you repeat the question, actually?
Yeah, so practical advice for people that are just beginning this journey and have just a small network. What I would say is the very first thing I would say is just follow this from a progression standpoint in some regards. Go find two or three other networks. So first of all, if you're in creation mode, so this really matters a lot. This is a big caveat. If you've got to execute something right now and you're being held accountable for delivering a campaign or whatever it is, some program, first of all, go execute that program, right? I mean, I'm not asking you to divert attention away from it. Go find your friends, deliver, deliver, deliver. When you hit the pause button and you're able to actually take a time out, go find 2 to 3 other networks that you wouldn't usually interact with. So go build your network but be very disciplined about it. A bigger network is not better. A better network is better. So go find 3 groups that you think would be valuable to you and go get like super intentional in building a deep bridge with just those 3 and leave all the rest alone for right now. So that would be my very strong practical advice is find 3 unordinary groups, 3 very non-typical groups for yourself, and that's how you'll go learn. So, cool. Yes, up here in the...
Starting up with a smaller organization, there's a lot of micromanaging that happens within the group because as a leader, you want to make sure that you have your hands on everything and everyone is involved. How do you know when to step back and then start to let it grow on its own and become bigger without micromanaging?
Yeah, so I think, and again, micromanaging has a role in this. So one of the things I hope that you've heard is formal systems, processes, and structures don't go away. They actually matter. It's just when you employ them. If you do that prematurely, what you end up doing is stifling out all the creativity. So one of the things I would do, one of the things we do inside large businesses is start thinking about growth and core. So start thinking about, what do we know that we've proven, and that now becomes the new core of the business and or, entity that we're generating. Stay fixated and micromanage the daylights out of the core because that's really important. It's stability for you. And then stay creative and agile on the edges with the growth side of the business. So even if you're 5 people, you can do that. Even if you're 5 people, you can say, I want you 3 to be locked and loaded on managing the core, making sure that we can manage this campaign with precision, whatever it happens to be. And then have the other 2 people dance around the edges and do the more creative stuff. If you have everybody doing everything, the shifting costs get you, messed up a little bit. So that would be my advice. Cool. Yes, another. Is this useful? Was this helpful? Yeah.
So my question is, there are leaders that don't always position their people effectively. Yeah. And as an organization, you want to continue to innovate and continue to grow. So if you're a big company, what can you do to actually make sure people are effectively positioning people?
I was actually with some CFOs yesterday. And they were having this conversation. They were thinking about how they could move people within. It was a small group of CFOs. They were thinking about how they could move people from one part of an organization. Somebody wanted to go do something. The person wanted to do something. And they basically wanted to give that person the benefit for their career to go do the thing that they wanted to do. But that person, she also wanted to do what she was still doing. So they were going to pull her apart and give her 2 jobs in 2 different, one was core, one was growth. And what I said was, what does the business need? What does the organization need? What does the institution? This was a small business, startup business. And what they said was they love her energy. They love what she's doing. They love her ability to be able to kind of evangelize and energize the customer base. And she's phenomenal at this. So actually, we had this long debate about how do you best position her for long-term success. And the short answer was, and I'm sharing this story to get very specific in response to you, the short answer was, go have a conversation with her and say, hey, you're phenomenal at this. And you can manage this thing, but we think it's beneath you for right now. Why don't you grow this thing to where when you do take that over and you do manage it as part of a core operation, it's much bigger than what it is today. And we had this, so that's just an example of how you don't just think about the person. A person matters. That person can leave, so I don't want to. And every right, she should have a voice about her career. But also being just very clear about, you can help us grow this and you're indispensable for us in this other role. If you grow it, then you'll grow into a bigger role and you can manage a general leadership role, which is what she was looking for. So you got to think about 2 things in short. You got to think about what they know, but you also got to think about how they're positioned inside the organization. And in that particular case, they decided to keep her in that role. Thanks. Do I have one more? We're done. Good. I can clap. Thank you.